Right, in this video, I'm going to do a quick look at solving quadratic equations. This should be a review from Math 100, and there are help features within my math lab if you need more help than what I'm going to provide. Okay, so on the left is the problem out of my math lab homework that I wanted you to do before last Thursday. So let's go ahead and look at that in case you were still having trouble. It gives us a good assortment, 5 questions on quadratics that you can begin kind of refreshing your memory on how this all works. Okay, so the first problem in that homework was to solve x squared minus 3x minus 18, and it said to solve by factoring. Okay. Get that off of there. Okay, so we're going to solve this by factoring. So we have it already equal to 0. That's always your first step on factoring or the quadratic, is to get things equal to 0. Then when you're trying to factor this is one that you definitely should try factoring on, because the coefficient of the x squared term is a 1. So you really just need to try to break it up. The best way to do this is just to unfoil, to think about how these binomials would have been multiplied. You know whatever's in the first spot would have to be an x to get an x squared. Then in the second spot, that is eventually what's at the end gets multiplied to make the 18. So when you're thinking about 18, the only possibilities are 1 and 18, 2 and 9, or 3 and 6. And whatever you put is going to have to be combined in some way to make a -3 there in the middle. So the only one that can come up with 3 is these two. If you made one positive, one negative, could make that happen. I usually just put them in like that, and then I look at what the signs would need to be. So, if you were foiling this out, you would have your first two being x squared. Your outside 2 would be, so your first 2 would have been x squared, your outside 2 would have been 6x, inside 2 would have been 3x, and the last 2 would be 18. Now you already knew that the first was x squared and the last was 18. So really what you're doing at this point is just looking to see how to make that middle term happen. Okay? And I like to write it just a little differently. But I wanted you to see where it came from. So I'm really just checking what that middle term needs to be. Let me change it to an eraser and see if that'll let me get rid of it. Okay, so what I do after I get my numbers in, let me just put that away. So what you really do is after you get that this has to be x and you're pretty sure this is like a 6 and a 3, is you think, okay, well, in the middle, when you do the inside 2, you get 6x. When you do the outside 2, you get 3x. And then you worry about what the signs would need to be. And since it needs to be negative, you'll put a negative on the 6, positive on the 3x, and then see how that would work like you need it to. So that tells you make the 6 negative and the 3 positive. All right, so that's a quick review of factoring. You get a little more with that in the homework. All right, but 100, one of the big ideas is solving quadratics, including being able to factor. So that should come back to you pretty quick. All right, so we have x minus 6 could be 0, or x plus 3 could be 0. And then if you solve these, you would just add 6 to both sides here, and you'd come up with x being 6. Here you'd subtract 3 from both sides and get x equals -3. So the solutions to this are the 6 and the -3. You're getting 2 solutions because this is quadratic. And so they have typically 2 solutions. So that's just a quick look at solving by factoring, okay? All right, so let me go back to my math lab homework, and let me get to the second question on that. Let's see if I just move ahead one. Okay, there we go. Okay, so the second one is 64w squared minus 9 equals 0. And this one just says solve. Doesn't say how. So I'm going to show you 2 things you could do. I'll come back to it after I show you something else. So we just were solving by factoring. We could solve by factoring here. That would be a very effective way to do it. And when I'm looking for what I'm going to put together to make 64w squared, I know I'm going to need a w on each. And 64 has a lot of factors, but see how it's a perfect square? So I'm going to try an 8 times 8. And then 9 is a perfect square, so I'm going to try 3 and 3 first. So if you have perfect squares like that, make that your first choice. So I'm going to make one positive and one negative. And so I'll set each of those factors. Oh, and that works because when you check that, I didn't mention it, but when you check it, that's 64w squared at the beginning. And see how that would be 24w, and this would be negative 24w. So when you multiply it out, let me just show it to you. When you multiply it out, when you do the 8 times the 8, you wind up getting your 64w squared. The 8w times the negative 3 is negative 24w. 3 times the 8w is positive 24w. And when you do the 3 times the 3, the 1 is negative, 1 is positive, you get a negative 9. So if I were to check it, I would wind up seeing that I get 64 squared minus 9. Okay, so that's just the check. That's not really the problem. So let me go back to the problem. All right, so the problem is just 8w plus, we got it factored into 8w plus 3 and 8w minus 3. Okay, so what we're going to do at this point is like we did on the other one. Because these two things are multiplied and equal to 0, I can set one to 0, or I can set the other one to 0. Both of those answers are going to work. So then you just do the algebra of that. You subtract 3. So 8w equals negative 3, and then you divide the 8 out. So one answer is negative 3/8, and the other one's going to turn out to be positive 3/8. Because we get 8w equals 3, and then when we divide by 8, we get w equals positive 3/8. Okay? So what you would put in as your answer would be a negative 3/8 and a positive 3/8. Okay? We'll come back and solve that one using the square root method. Maybe. I'm not sure. I'm going to take time to do that or not. All right, let's go ahead and look at the third problem on this one. Okay, so this one says to solve using the quadratic formula. And what we're getting on it, or have on it, is 2x squared minus 3x minus 1 equals 0. And it said use the quadratic formula on it. Okay, so on that one, I'm going to need a little more room. I'm going to make this just a tad bigger. Okay, well, no, it's not letting me make that box like I want. Okay, hold on. Okay, so I wanted to write the quadratic formula. The quadratic formula says I'll go ahead and just make it full screen. Okay, quadratic formula says if you have something that looks like this, ax squared, some number times x squared, some number times x, plus a number equal to 0, and the square term is there. This isn't a 0 out in front, so you really do have a squared term. Then the solutions are given by the formula x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac, all of that divided by 2a. Now notice all that's over on the right-hand side are the letters a, b, and c, and the a, the b, and the c are numbers. So you don't have any x's over there. What you're going to get when you plug into that will be the numbers that will work. I will find the numbers that I could plug in for x that would make that true. So what you do is you make sure that what you have looks like this to start with. So it has to equal 0 like it does for factoring. Then you identify your A, your B, and your C. Make sure you include the sign. So if it's got a negative in front of it, make sure you include that. Okay. All right, once you've identified that, you're going to plug into the formula. So let me write down the formula, getting ready to put the stuff where it belongs. So I'm just kind of writing the formula, but leaving a slot for those values. So here goes the B, which is -3. This is also B, because that's where B squared should go. -4 times A times C over 2 times A. So it's just a formula. Just plug into it. Hard part is typically the last part when you do your simplifying. So I like to go ahead and work this out and work this out. And notice that fraction bar goes underneath everything. Okay. Then under here I have -3 squared, which is 9. And then I have minus and 4 times 2 times -1. See, the minus times the minus would be plus, and 4 times 2 would be 8. So this radical is a grouping symbol, so you have to do that next. So you'll have 3 plus or minus the square root of 17, all of that over 4. Okay. Now this problem happens to be finished at that point. Sometimes this right here needs to be simplified. So like if that had been the square root of 20, we would have had to break down the radical. But on this one, we're done. This is our answer. Okay. All right, so that's the third problem in the preview homework. Just getting you to remember how to solve using the quadratic formula. Okay. So now we'll look at another one just with different numbers and see what happens. Okay. All right, so on number 4, you've got to solve x squared minus 8x plus 41, and it really doesn't factor. There's no other way to do it easily. You would definitely use the quadratic formula on this one too. All right, you got to identify the A, the B, and the C. So A is 1, B is -8, and C is 41. Then you go and plug into your formula, so get your formula set up and ready. You will need to memorize it, so write it down a bunch of times, and that'll help with that. Also, there's videos, stories that people have written about it. Just Google it, and you can use those if you need to, to try to memorize it. So B is -8, so it goes here and here. This should be 4AC, so I'm going to put a 1 for the A and a 41 for the C, and then 2 times A. A is 1. All right, so the quadratic formula is nice because it's a formula, so it always kind of works the same way to that point. Then I like you to go ahead and do this and get 8, do this and get 2, but don't divide those yet because you got a horizontal fraction bar. You have to be careful. Work under the radical. This is a positive 64 because -8 times itself. Those parentheses are important. -8 times itself would be 64. There's only one negative, so that's minus something, and 4 times 41 would be 164. Okay. All right, next I'm going to work on this part under here. Okay, so that gives me 8 plus or minus square root of, and 64 minus 164 is -100, all over 2. Okay. All right, so now we work on the radical right here. So we take the square root of -100, and in the complex number video, I showed this also. And there's also some review of simplifying quadratics within the homework on quadratics. But one thing I noticed is the negative under the radical. See, -100 is -1 times 100. So we can pull out that square root of -1 and replace it with an I, and then 100 is a perfect square, so the square root of that is 10. So we're going to have 8 plus or minus 10I, and all of that divided by 2. Now this one can be broken down further, because that 2 goes into both the 8 and the 10. So you would go on, and the reason this works is that numerator really has 2 as a factor. Pull a 2 out of the first term, pull a 2 out of the second one. You have 2 times 4 plus or minus 5i on top, really. And then that's multiplication, so you can just cancel out the 2's. Now, normally what we show is this. 2 goes into 8 4 times and into 10 5 times. So your answer would be 4 plus or minus 5i. Now, you can only do that if something goes into all 3 of those. See, that 2 that we divided into the numerator, we could do that because 2 was actually a factor of that numerator. And then this would be your final answer on number 4. Okay? Then I want to do one more of those. Let's look at number 5. Here we're solving using the square root property. Okay, so with that one, they're asking you to do it because it's the best way to do this one. Solve using the square root property. Works good when you have like that, see that parentheses with something squared? When you can isolate what's being squared, that's when you'd want to do this. So what we're going to do here is first work on getting that part by itself. So we've got to get rid of the 2 first. So we'll just divide by 2. Then that would be x plus 3 squared equals 18. So this process is based on just undoing whatever's been done to x. So the next thing I'm going to try to undo is this 2 right here. Because this is squared, to undo it, I'm going to square root both sides. Now, there are 2 square roots of any number, so be sure you get both of them. So put that plus or minus out in front. So this would be x plus 3 squared. Under here, you'd have plus or minus the square root of 18. Okay. So the square root undoes the squaring. So on the left side, we have x plus 3. On the right side, we just have that square root of 18, which we'll simplify in a minute. I like to go ahead and get my x undone completely, so I'm going to subtract 3. Now, when I do, the best place I think to put it is right there, so that you don't get confused about whether you should subtract 3 from 18 or not. You know, the 18 is under a radical. That's not 18. It's square root of 18, so don't subtract 3 from it. So you wind up with x equals negative 3 plus or minus the square root of 18. So to finish this, what I got to do is take square root of 18 and simplify it. So there, I could do, there's 2 ways you simplify radicals. Okay, one of them is to think about the factors, if the number's small enough especially, to think about the perfect squares like 4, 9, 16, 25, etc. Notice how 9 goes into 18? So I can rewrite 18 as 9 times 2. So the square root of 9, square root of 2 is what I'm going to break it up into. And the square root of 9 I can do where the 2 is going to be trapped underneath that radical. So my final answer on this would be negative 3 plus or minus 3 square root of 2. Okay, that's it. All right, so in this video, we were just looking at a quick review of solving quadratic equations by factoring, by quadratic formula, and then this last one is called the square root method because of this step right here, where you wind up taking the square root of both sides, but you don't do it until you get the squared part by itself.